Daniel sneered across the mahogany table, his voice cutting through the elegant restaurant. "Let's be honest, Becky. You've always been worthless to this family," he said, lifting his wine glass in a mock toast. I smiled calmly, taking a small sip of water before opening the envelope beside my plate. "Actually, Harold and Eleanor thought quite differently," I replied, sliding the document toward him. "That's why they left Pine Creek Manor to me, all 12 acres of it." His face drained of color as champagne flutes clinked around us. The family celebration had only just begun. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The story. The evening had started like any other Cooper family gathering. Uncomfortable silence punctuated by passive-aggressive comments. I'd spent nearly an hour deciding what to wear, finally settling on a simple black dress that Eleanor had once complimented. "Simple but elegant," she'd said. One of the few kind remarks I'd received from Daniel's family in the 3 years I'd been married to his brother Thomas. Thomas's absence hung in the air as I entered the harvest table alone. 6 months since the accident, and this was my first time facing his family without him beside me. Daniel had insisted on this dinner to discuss family matters, though his text message carried the same dismissive tone he'd always used with me. I knew what this was really about. With Thomas gone, they no longer had to pretend I belonged. The host guided me to the private dining room where Daniel, Melissa, and Daniel's college friend Brett were already seated. Daniel barely looked up when I entered, instead swirling the amber liquid in his glass while Melissa offered a tight smile that never reached her eyes. "You're late," Daniel remarked, though I was precisely on time. This was always his way, establishing control before conversation even began. I took my seat silently, noticing the envelope placed at my setting. "We ordered for you," Melissa said, as if it were a kindness rather than another small way of removing my choices. "The salmon. You always order salmon." I nodded, though I hadn't ordered salmon since Thomas passed away. Small details like this, the assumptions, the talking over me, the dismissal of my preferences, had defined my relationship with the Coopers from the beginning. Thomas had always run interference, smoothing over Daniel's cutting remarks and his parents' subtle exclusions. Without him, I was fully exposed to the family's true feelings. "So," Daniel began, leaning forward slightly. "As I mentioned, we needed to discuss some family matters. Specifically, my parents' estate." Harold and Eleanor had passed within weeks of each other just a month ago. A second wave of grief that had washed over me just as I was learning to breathe again after losing Thomas. They had never fully warmed to me, but in those final months, as they too dealt with Thomas's loss, something had shifted. Eleanor had invited me for tea several times, and Harold had asked for my help organizing their photo albums. Those quiet afternoons at Pine Creek Manor had formed a fragile bridge between us, one I thought Daniel had been unaware of. "I know this is a difficult time for everyone," I said carefully, "but I'm not sure why I needed to be here for this discussion. The estate is a family matter, and as you've frequently reminded me, I'm not really family." Daniel's mouth curled into something between a smile and a sneer. "Exactly the point. With my parents gone and circumstances being what they are, we need to formalize some things. You've been staying in the apartment that Thomas paid for, driving the car Thomas bought." "Daniel," Melissa cut in with feigned gentleness, "we agreed to be delicate." "There's no point in delicacy," Daniel continued. "The facts are simple. Thomas is gone. My parents are gone. The family needs to consolidate assets, and you, Becky, need to move on." The waiter chose that moment to arrive with our meals, the rich aroma of the food contrasting sharply with the sourness filling my stomach. I watched as Daniel pulled a document from his suit jacket once the server had departed. "This is a simple agreement," he said, sliding it across the table. "You'll vacate the apartment by the end of the month, return the car to the family, and relinquish any misguided claim you might think you have to any Cooper assets. Brett, who had remained silent until now, nodded approvingly. Daniel's being generous here. Legally, he could probably demand repayment for the support Thomas provided. I stared at the document, its legal jargon swimming before my eyes. 3 years of marriage, 6 months of grief, and this was what it came down to. Being erased from their lives with cold efficiency. "Why now?" I asked, looking up to meet Daniel's gaze. "It's been barely a month since your parents passed." "Because," Daniel said, setting down his fork with a precise movement, "it's time to be honest. Thomas married you despite our objections. He was always soft that way, picking up strays, trying to fix broken things." Melissa jumped in, her tone sticky with false sympathy. "What Daniel means is that Thomas saw your potential, but now that he's gone—" "No," Daniel interrupted. "Let's not sugarcoat it. She came from nothing, brought nothing to the family, and now wants to cling to what isn't hers. The Cooper legacy, the business, the property, the standing in this community. Those weren't built for someone like you to simply step into." I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that always came with Daniel's attacks, but this time, something was different. Perhaps it was the months of grief, or the afternoons with Harold and Eleanor, or simply that I had nothing left to lose. But the fear that usually accompanied this feeling was absent. "Someone like me?" I repeated, keeping my voice level. Daniel leaned forward, the overhead light catching the silver at his temples. "Let's be honest, Becky. You've always been worthless to this family. An inconvenience Thomas brought home that we tolerated out of love for him. But that obligation ended when he wrapped his car around that tree." The table went silent. Even Melissa seemed shocked by the cruelty in his words. I became acutely aware of the weight of the envelope that had been placed at my setting, not by the restaurant staff, I now realized, but intentionally left for this moment. With steady hands that surprised even me, I opened it and removed the contents. A letter with the Williamson and Associates letterhead and several legal documents. "Actually, Daniel," I said, my voice clearer than it had been in months, "Harold and Eleanor felt quite differently about my place in the family." I unfolded the letter and began to read aloud. "Dear Mrs. Rebecca Cooper, in accordance with the final wishes of Harold and Eleanor Cooper, as amended on March 15th, we are pleased to inform you that you have been named the primary beneficiary of their estate, including Pine Creek Manor and all associated property comprising 12 acres, as well as a substantial portion of their investment portfolio." I slid the document toward Daniel, whose face had drained of color. "They changed their will 2 weeks before they passed away. Mr. Williamson said they were quite clear about their wishes." Daniel snatched the papers, his eyes scanning frantically. "This isn't possible. This must be fraud." "You can call Mr. Williamson yourself," I replied, taking a sip of my water. "In fact, I'm meeting him tomorrow to discuss the management of the property. He mentioned something about the caretaker's cottage being perfect for you and Melissa if you need somewhere to stay while you consolidate your assets." Melissa's hand flew to her throat. "What does that mean?" I turned to her with genuine sympathy. "It means that Pine Creek Manor belongs to me now, and the family business, well, Harold transferred his controlling shares to me as well. I didn't ask for any of this, Melissa. But apparently, those afternoons I spent with your in-laws meant more to them than Daniel's occasional visits when he needed money." Daniel's face flushed from white to red. "You manipulated them when they were grieving and vulnerable." "No, Daniel," I said, finally cutting into the salmon I hadn't ordered. "I simply showed them kindness when they needed it most, something you might have considered trying." Brett cleared his throat awkwardly. "Maybe I should give you all some privacy." "Stay," I said firmly. "In fact, Brett, you might be interested to know that Harold specifically mentioned you in our conversations. Something about a business loan from 2015 that was never properly documented as a gift rather than a loan." Mr. Williamson has those details as well. The restaurant continued to buzz around us, other patrons oblivious to the seismic shift occurring at our table. Daniel was still clutching the papers, his knuckles white, while Melissa dabbed at tears that had begun to fall. "I never wanted this power over you," I continued, feeling a strange calm. "I would trade all of it to have Thomas back, to have parents who lived long enough to meet their grandchildren. What I wanted was family, Daniel. What you offered was conditional acceptance that vanished the moment Thomas did." I reached for my purse and placed enough cash to cover my meal on the table. "I'll have Mr. Williamson contact you regarding the details. For now, I think we've said all that needs to be said." As I stood to leave, Daniel grabbed my wrist. "You can't just walk away with everything my family built." I looked down at his hand, then up to meet his eyes. "I'm not walking away with everything, Daniel. Just what Harold and Eleanor wanted me to have." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "They also left you something, a letter. Mr. Williamson has it at his office. I suggest you read it before we speak again." With that, I gently removed his hand from my wrist and walked out of the harvest table into the cool evening air of Mapleton. For the first time since Thomas's accident, my steps felt lighter, purposeful. I wasn't naive enough to think this was the end of the struggle with Daniel, but something fundamental had shifted. As I reached my car, Thomas's car, as Daniel had so coldly pointed out, my phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "How did it go? Do you need me to come over?" I typed back a reply. "I'm okay. Better than okay. I'll tell you everything tomorrow." And I was okay. The grief was still there, would always be there. But now it was accompanied by something unexpected. A future I could shape on my own terms. Not as Thomas's widow or the Coopers' inconvenient in-law, but as Rebecca Mitchell Cooper, who was never as worthless as Daniel had believed. If you've ever found yourself underestimated or dismissed by those who should have valued you most, remember that sometimes the greatest victories come quietly, when you simply stand in your truth. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories of unexpected turning points and the strength we find when pushed to our limits. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Your support means everything. Unlike Daniel, I know your true worth. The drive back to my apartment felt surreal. Streetlights illuminated the familiar route through Mapleton, past the bakery where Thomas and I had ordered our wedding cake, the park where we'd spent countless Sunday afternoons, the bookstore where I'd first met Eleanor for an awkward cup of tea after Thomas had insisted his mother just needed time to warm up to me. 3 years of memories in this small town, all viewed through a new lens now. I pulled into the parking space of the downtown loft building. The space Daniel had so casually mentioned was never truly mine. As I stepped out of the car, the night air carried the faint scent of jasmine from the planters lining Main Street. For a moment, I simply stood there, keys in hand, letting the enormity of the evening wash over me. My phone buzzed again. Jessica, checking in. I texted that I was home safe and would call her tomorrow. Then, almost as an afterthought, I added, "Everything's changed." The elevator ride to the 4th floor gave me time to collect my thoughts. I'd never planned for this outcome, never schemed to secure Harold and Eleanor's fortune. The time I'd spent with them after Thomas's death had been genuine, grief drawing us together in unexpected ways. Now I found myself in possession of not just property but power, and the responsibility that came with it weighed heavily. Inside my apartment, our apartment, Thomas's presence was still everywhere. His reading glasses on the side table, the collection of vinyl records he'd been so proud of, the framed photo of us on our honeymoon in Maine, windswept and laughing on a rocky beach. I ran my fingers along the spines of his books, wondering what he would make of tonight's revelation. "You always saw the best in him," I whispered to the empty room, even when he couldn't see it in me. Daniel and Thomas had been different from the beginning. That much had been clear within minutes of meeting them both. Where Thomas was warm and open, Daniel was calculating and cold. Thomas had built his architectural firm from scratch, refusing to join the Cooper family business despite Daniel's pressure. "I need to make my own way," he'd told me once. Daniel never understood that. Now, ironically, I controlled the very company Thomas had rejected, the real estate development firm that had been the source of the Cooper family's wealth for 3 generations. The thought was almost too absurd to contemplate. I poured myself a glass of water and settled onto the sofa, retrieving copies of the documents I'd shown Daniel from my purse. Mr. Williamson had walked me through everything the previous day, his kind eyes watching carefully as he explained the extent of what Harold and Eleanor had left me. "They were most insistent," he'd said, sliding the folder across his desk. "Especially after they learned about Daniel's plans to sell Pine Creek Manor to that resort developer. That had been the first I'd heard of such plans." "He was going to sell their home?" Mr. Williamson had nodded gravely. Within days of their passing, he was already in negotiations. Harold suspected something was coming. Daniel had been pressuring them to move into a retirement community for years. That's partly why they updated their will. The memory of Mr. Williamson's words echoed as I reviewed the documents again. Beyond the manor and the business shares, there were investments, artwork, and family heirlooms, all now mine to manage. The responsibility was overwhelming, especially for someone who'd grown up with so little. My childhood in the rural outskirts of Mapleton had been modest at best. A small farmhouse with perpetually peeling paint, secondhand clothes, and discounted groceries. My father leaving when I was 12, my mother working double shifts as a nurse to keep us afloat. Daniel had been right about one thing. I hadn't brought financial assets to my marriage with Thomas. But he'd been wrong about everything else. I must have fallen asleep on the sofa because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the windows and my phone was ringing. Jessica's name flashed on the screen. "You can't just text everything's changed and then ghost me," she said when I answered. "I've been worried sick." Jessica had been my anchor through the past 6 months, the friend who brought groceries, unasked, who sat through silent evenings when grief had stolen my words, who defended me fiercely when whispers about that gold digger Thomas Cooper married reached her ears. "I'm sorry," I said, rubbing sleep from my eyes. It was a lot to process. "I'm coming over. 20 minutes. Have coffee ready." She hung up before I could protest. True to her word, Jessica arrived precisely 19 minutes later, her curly hair pulled into a messy bun, concern etched on her face. She took in my rumpled dress from the night before and the documents spread across the coffee table. "Okay," she said, accepting the mug I offered. "Spill." So I did. I told her everything. Daniel's coldness, his ultimatum, the documents he'd wanted me to sign. And then the revelation, the look on his face as he realized his parents had chosen me as their heir. When I finished, Jessica was silent for a long moment. Then she let out a low whistle. "Holy shit, Becky. You own Pine Creek Manor and the company?" The way she said it, with such disbelief, made me laugh for what felt like the first time in months. "Apparently. What are you going to do?" It was the question I'd been asking myself all night. "I don't know yet. I never wanted their money. I just wanted." I trailed off, unsure how to express what I'd been seeking from the Cooper family. "Acceptance," Jessica finished for me, "which they never gave you. Except, it sounds like Harold and Eleanor finally did in the end." I nodded, throat tight with unexpected emotion. I think they saw something in those last months. Not just in me, but in Daniel too. Something they didn't want to admit before. Jessica took a sip of her coffee, studying me over the rim of her mug. And now Daniel's realizing it too late. "He'll fight this," I said, gathering the papers into a neater pile. "You know he will." Let him try. Jessica's fierceness was one of the qualities I loved most about her. What did the lawyer say? That everything is solid. Harold and Eleanor were of sound mind when they made the changes. There were witnesses, medical documentation. They knew Daniel might contest it. Smart old folks, Jessica nodded approvingly. So what's next? Meeting with the lawyer? Yes, at 11. I glanced at the clock. I should get ready. Jessica stood, collecting our empty mugs. I'm coming with you. You don't have to. Not up for debate. Her tone was light, but determined. Besides, I want to see this Mr. Williamson who's about to help you take down the mighty Daniel Cooper. 2 hours later, we sat in the tastefully appointed conference room at Williamson & Associates. The offices occupied the top floor of one of the few modern buildings in Mapleton's historic downtown, all gleaming glass and polished hardwood, with views of the river that cut through the heart of the town. Mr. Williamson himself was a study. In contrasts, traditional in his impeccable suit and carefully knotted tie, but surprisingly progressive in his thinking. I estimated him to be in his mid-60s, with silver hair and kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled, which he did warmly as he extended his hand to Jessica. Ms. Taylor, a pleasure. Mrs. Cooper has mentioned your steadfast support these past months. Once we were settled, cups of excellent coffee before us, Mr. Williamson opened a leather portfolio. I expect you've had some time to process what we discussed yesterday, he began. And I imagine last night's dinner was eventful. You could say that, I replied, recounting the confrontation with Daniel. Mr. Williamson nodded thoughtfully. Not unexpected. Daniel has always had a certain expectation about his place in the family hierarchy. Harold found it concerning, especially in recent years. Daniel mentioned consolidating assets, I said. Was the family business in trouble? Not at all, Mr. Williamson assured me. Cooper Development is quite profitable. However, Daniel has been leveraging his portion of the business for some personal ventures that haven't panned out as well as he'd hoped. His urgency to sell Pine Creek Manor was likely connected to those financial pressures. Jessica leaned forward. So he's broke? Not broke, Mr. Williamson clarified, but certainly not as liquid as he would prefer to be. The Cooper name still carries significant weight in Mapleton, which has allowed Daniel to maintain appearances. And now he needs the manor, I said, pieces clicking into place. Precisely. The potential sale to Evergreen Resorts would have resolved his immediate financial concerns quite neatly. I thought about Pine Creek Manor, the graceful old house with its wide porches and oak-lined drive, the gardens Eleanor had tended so carefully, the sense of history in every room. I can't imagine turning it into a resort. Nor could Harold and Eleanor, Mr. Williamson said. Which brings us to this. He removed an envelope from his portfolio, cream-colored stationery with my name written in Eleanor's elegant script. They left you this letter, along with one for Daniel, which I'll deliver to him today. My hands trembled slightly as I accepted it. Should I read it now? That's entirely up to you, Mrs. Cooper. It's private correspondence. But if you'd like a moment. Jessica squeezed my hand. We can wait. I carefully opened the envelope, unfolding 2 pages covered in Eleanor's distinctive handwriting. Dear Rebecca, if you're reading this, then Harold and I have passed. And Mr. Williamson has explained our decision regarding Pine Creek Manor and the family business. I imagine this comes as quite a shock, and perhaps you're wondering why we've chosen this path. When Thomas first brought you home, I confess I was not as welcoming as I should have been. The Cooper family has certain traditions, certain expectations, and you represented something unfamiliar. For that initial coldness, I am profoundly sorry. What I didn't understand then, what took me far too long to see, was that Thomas had found in you precisely what the Cooper family had lost somewhere along the way. Genuine warmth, integrity, and the courage to value people above position. After we lost Thomas, and I say we because your grief was every bit as real as ours, you could have distanced yourself from two difficult old people who had never quite embraced you as they should have. Instead, you showed us kindness. The why. Afternoons you spent helping Harold organize his photographs, listening to his stories, bringing life into rooms that had grown too quiet. They meant more to us than you'll ever know. During those months, we also saw with painful clarity what Daniel had become. His eagerness to sell the family home before we were even gone, his dismissal of Thomas's memory, his cruelty toward you. These were not Cooper values as Harold's. Father taught them to him, or as we tried to instill in our sons. Pine Creek Manor has been in the Cooper family for generations, but a name alone doesn't make a family. Love does. Respect does. The kind of quiet strength you've shown in the face of unimaginable loss does. We leave you our home and Harold's company not as a reward, but as a trust. We believe you understand what these things truly represent, not wealth or status, but history, commitment to community, and the responsibility to carry forward something meaningful. Daniel will be angry. He will likely try to challenge this decision. But know that we were of sound mind and absolute certainty when we made it. Mr. Williamson has ensured everything is legally binding. Whatever you choose to do with Pine Creek Manor and the company, whether you live in the house, sell it to someone who will love it, or find some other purpose for it, we trust your judgment. All we ask is that you make your decisions with the same heart and integrity that made Thomas love you, and that eventually helped two stubborn old people see what a gift you are to our family. With deepest affection and absolute faith in you, Eleanor Cooper. Tears blurred my vision as I finished reading. Jessica handed me a tissue without comment, her presence steady beside me. Mr. Williamson waited patiently, his expression sympathetic. She knew Daniel would fight this, I said finally, carefully refolding the letter. Yes, Mr. Williamson agreed. Harold and Eleanor harbored no illusions about their elder son. They hoped the letter they left for him might inspire some reflection, but they were pragmatic about the likelihood. I took a deep breath, straightening in my chair. What do I need to do next? Mr. Williamson smiled slightly, as if pleased by my question. There are several matters requiring attention. The formal reading of the will takes place next week, Tuesday. At 10 a.m. in this office, Daniel will receive official notification today. In the meantime, there are some operational decisions regarding Cooper development that would benefit from your input. He slid a folder across the table. Richard Barnes has been serving as interim CEO since Harold stepped back last year. He's been with the company for nearly 3 decades and was Harold's most trusted executive. I'd recommend meeting with him sooner rather than later. The idea of stepping into a corporate office as the controlling shareholder of a company I knew almost nothing about was intimidating, to say the least. I don't have any experience in real estate development. Few people inherit family businesses with prior expertise, Mr. Williamson said kindly. Harold didn't expect you to take over day-to-day operations. Richard is more than capable in that regard. But as majority shareholder, your vision for the company will matter. Jessica, who had been taking mental notes throughout, spoke up. What about Pine Creek Manor? Does Becky need to do anything there immediately? The staff has been informed of the change in ownership. Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, and Mr. Fenton, who manages the grounds, have been with the family for years. They'll continue maintaining the property unless you direct otherwise. The thought of staff waiting for my instructions was another layer of unreality. And Daniel? Does he need to move out? Daniel and Melissa maintain their own residence in the Hillcrest neighborhood, Mr. Williamson explained. However, Daniel keeps an office at Pine Creek Manor, where he sometimes works. Legally, you could restrict his access immediately, but that would escalate things, I finished. The last thing I wanted was a confrontation at the manor. Precisely. If I may offer some advice?" At my nod, Mr. Williamson continued, "Daniel will attempt to portray you as opportunistic and manipulative, the young widow who took advantage of grieving parents. How you conduct yourself in these early days will either reinforce or undermine that narrative. So I need to be careful." "Considerate but firm," Mr. Williamson corrected. "The Cooper name carries weight in Mapleton. People will be watching how this transition unfolds." By the time we left Mr. Williamson's office, it was past 1 o'clock. Jessica and I walked down Main Street to Rosie's Cafe, a local institution, where the lunch crowd was beginning to thin. "Your head must be spinning," Jessica said as we slid into a booth by the window. Understatement of the century. I absent-mindedly studied the menu I'd seen 100 times before. Part of me feels like I should just sign it all back over to Daniel and walk away. Jessica lowered her menu with alarming speed. "Don't you? Not after what he's put you through. Not after what Eleanor and Harold wanted." "I know, but no buts. Daniel Cooper has been dismissing you, belittling you, and trying to erase you since the day you married Thomas. And now, finally, there's some justice in the universe." A server approached, Maggie, who'd gone to high school with Jessica. After exchanging quick greetings, we ordered sandwiches and iced tea. Once Maggie moved to another table, Jessica leaned forward. "Look, I get that this is overwhelming. But think about it. Not just what you could do with the money, but what you could do with the company. Cooper Development has shaped this town for generations, usually for the better, until Daniel started pushing for that strip mall on the old Johnson property." She was right. Cooper Development was responsible for much of Mapleton's thoughtful growth: the restored historic district, the affordable housing project by the community college, the Riverside Park. At least until recently, when Daniel's influence had begun, pushing for developments that prioritized quick profits over community benefit. "Thomas would have ideas," I said quietly, "about the manor, the company, all of it." Jessica reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "Yes, he would. And you knew him better than anyone. What would he want you to do?" Before I could answer, the bell above the cafe door jingled. Daniel walked in, his gaze sweeping the room until it landed on me. His expression darkened immediately. After a brief exchange with the hostess, he strode purposefully toward our booth. "Rebecca." He didn't acknowledge Jessica. "We need to talk, privately." "Hello, Daniel," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "I don't think we have anything to discuss until the reading of the will next week." "Don't play innocent. I just came from Williamson's office." Daniel's voice was low but intense, his carefully maintained public persona slipping. "Whatever game you're playing." "This isn't a game," I interrupted, suddenly tired of his assumptions. "And this isn't the place for this conversation." Daniel glanced around, seeming to register for the first time that several other patrons were watching with interest. The Cooper family drama would be all over town by dinner. "Fine," he said tightly, "but this isn't over. That letter changes nothing." After he left, Jessica let out a breath. "Well, that was uncomfortable. What letter was he talking about?" "Eleanor and Harold left one for him too. Mr. Williamson must have given it to him after we left." "I'd pay good money to know what it said," Jessica mused. "Whatever it was, it didn't change his mind." I watched through the window as Daniel stalked to his car, a sleek black Mercedes that had always felt like a deliberate contrast to Thomas's more modest Volvo. Our food arrived, though neither of us had much appetite now. As we picked at our sandwiches, I found my thoughts drifting to Pine Creek Manor. I hadn't been back since before Harold and Eleanor passed. The last time had been for tea with Eleanor, about 2 weeks before she fell ill. She'd seemed tired, but otherwise her usual self, insisting on showing me the spring bulbs beginning to emerge in her garden. "I think I need to go there," I said suddenly. "To the manor." Jessica looked up from her sandwich. "Now?" "Soon, maybe tomorrow. I need to see it. differently. Not as Thomas's wife visiting his parents, but as I couldn't quite bring myself to say the owner. As Eleanor and Harold wanted you to see it, Jessica supplied. I think that's a good idea. Want me to come with you? I considered it. No, I think I need to do this part alone, but thank you. Our conversation turned to practical matters then. What I should wear to meet with Richard Barnes at Cooper Development. Whether I should consider moving to Pine Creek Manor or staying in the apartment. How to handle the inevitable town gossip. Through it all, I felt a strange new sensation taking root alongside my grief. A tentative sense of possibility. That evening, after Jessica left, I found myself drawn to Thomas's desk in the corner of our living room. I hadn't touched it since. The accident, leaving his projects and papers exactly as they were on that last morning. Now, I gently opened the top drawer, finding his sketchbook where he'd always kept it. Thomas had been a gifted architect with an eye for how spaces could serve people rather than the other way around. His firm, though small, had developed a reputation for thoughtful design that honored both history and modern needs. I'd always loved watching him work, the intensity of his focus as he transformed blank pages into buildings that would shelter lives and stories. I carefully turned the pages of his sketchbook until I found what I was looking for, his drawings of Pine Creek Manor. He'd done them the first time I'd visited his childhood home, capturing the graceful lines of the old house from different angles. But Thomas being Thomas, he hadn't just drawn what was, he'd imagined what could be. In the margins were small notations. Guest cottage could be converted to studio space. East wing perfect for community gatherings. Gardens ideal for educational programs. Thomas had always seen Pine Creek Manor not just as a family home, but as a resource with potential beyond its walls. He'd talked sometimes about how the property could serve the community while preserving its history, though Daniel had always dismissed such ideas as impractical. As I studied his sketches by the soft lamplight, a plan began to form. Not fully realized yet, but the beginnings of one. A way to honor not just Eleanor and Harold's legacy, but Thomas's vision as well. A purpose for Pine Creek Manor that neither Daniel's resort developers nor my own limited perspective had considered. I reached for my phone and opened my calendar. Tomorrow, I would visit the manor. The day after, I would meet with Richard Barnes at Cooper Development. Next week would bring the formal reading of the will and, likely, the beginning of Daniel's legal challenges. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. Daniel wouldn't simply accept his parents' decision, especially with his financial pressures. There would be lawyers and arguments, public opinion to navigate, and my own grief still to process. But for the first time since Thomas's accident, I felt something like purpose stirring within me. Eleanor's letter had said they trusted my judgment. Thomas's sketches suggested he would have too. Now I needed to trust myself, to believe that I could be more than just Thomas Cooper's widow or Daniel Cooper's adversary. I could be Rebecca Cooper in my own right, with my own vision for the legacy unexpectedly placed in my hands. I closed the sketchbook gently and returned it to the drawer. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, I would allow myself to rest in the knowledge that I was exactly where Harold and Eleanor had wanted me to be. Not because I had manipulated or schemed, but because I had simply been myself. And somehow, against all odds, that had been enough. The morning sun cast long shadows across Pine Creek Manor's sweeping lawn as I drove through the wrought iron gates. I'd called ahead to let Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, know I was coming, but still felt like an intruder as I navigated the curved driveway. The gravel crunched beneath my tires, announcing my arrival to the stately house that now, somehow, belonged to me. I parked behind a weathered blue pickup truck that I recognized as belonging to Mr. Fenton, the groundskeeper. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out into the crisp autumn air, my gaze drawn upward to the manor's distinctive facade. 3 stories of weathered brick with white columns flanking the entrance, dormer windows peering out from the slate roof. like watchful eyes. Thomas had loved this house. He'd told me once that despite the tension with his family, especially Daniel, Pine Creek Manor itself had always felt like home. I could see why. There was something timeless about the property. Not just the house, but the ancient oak trees lining the drive, the carefully tended gardens now preparing for winter, the small stream that wound through the eastern edge of the property. It had a soul, this place. Mrs. Cooper. Mrs. Winters appeared at the front door, her silver hair pulled back in its usual neat bun, her expression carefully neutral. I'd always liked Mrs. Winters, who had been with the Cooper family since before Thomas was born. She had a no-nonsense efficiency that somehow never diminished her warmth. "Good morning, Mrs. Winters," I said, climbing the wide front steps. "Thank you for accommodating my visit on such short notice." "Of course." She held the door open. "Mr. Williamson called to explain the circumstances. I've prepared tea in the morning room, if that suits you." The morning room had been Eleanor's favorite space, a sunlit corner of the house with windows on two sides overlooking the gardens. It was less formal than the main sitting room, furnished with comfortable chairs and shelves lined with Eleanor's collection of gardening books. Thomas had told me once that when he was a boy, this was where he would find his mother on rainy days, planning her next garden project. "Perfect," I said, following her into the house. The familiar scent of beeswax polish and fresh flowers enveloped me as we walked through the entrance hall. Everything was exactly as I remembered. The antique grandfather clock marking time in the corner, family photographs arranged on side tables, the Persian carpet that Harold had inherited from his grandmother. Yet it all felt different now, viewed through the lens of ownership rather than as a guest. "Mrs. Winters," I began as we reached the morning room, "I want you to know that I had no idea about Harold and Eleanor's plans. This has been as much a surprise to me as to anyone." The older woman's expression softened slightly. "I believe you, Mrs. Cooper, and if I may speak plainly, it wasn't a surprise to those of us who saw how you were with them these past months." Her words eased something tight in my chest. I'd been bracing for suspicion, for the assumption that I had somehow engineered this inheritance. "Thank you for that." "The tea will be ready momentarily," she said, gesturing to the comfortable chairs by the window. "Would you like me to show you through the house first, or would you prefer some time to yourself?" I considered the question. "Actually, is Mr. Fenton available? I'd like to speak with both of you about the property and your roles here." "I'll fetch him," Mrs. Winters nodded, leaving me alone in the sunlit room. I moved to the windows, looking out over Eleanor's beloved gardens. Even in autumn, with many plants retreating for winter, the space was thoughtfully designed. Ornamental grasses catching the morning light, late-blooming asters adding spots of purple and blue, structural elements like stone paths and iron trellises, providing form. Eleanor had explained once that a good garden had bones that held it together even when the flowers faded. Behind me, the door opened. "Mrs. Cooper?" Mr. Fenton's voice was hesitant. He stood in the doorway, his weathered face lined with uncertainty, cloth cap held respectfully in his hands. Behind him, Mrs. Winters carried a tea tray. "Mr. Fenton, thank you for coming in," I said, gesturing to the chairs. "Please both of you sit. I'd like us to talk openly." They exchanged glances before complying, perching somewhat uncomfortably on the edges of their chairs while Mrs. Winters poured tea. I accepted a cup, grateful for the familiar ritual that gave me a moment to organize my thoughts. "I imagine this situation is awkward for both of you," I began. "You've served the Cooper family faithfully for years, and now suddenly I paused, still unable to say owner without feeling like an imposter. "Now you're the mistress of Pine Creek Manor," Mrs. Winters finished matter-of-factly. "And you're wondering where we stand." "Yes," I admitted. "And I want you to know that I value your experience and dedication. Nothing needs to change in terms of your positions here, unless you wish it to. Mr. Fenton's shoulders relaxed slightly. Appreciate that, Mrs. Cooper. Been tending these grounds for 22 years now. Wouldn't know what to do with myself elsewhere. The gardens are beautiful, I said sincerely. Eleanor was so proud of your work together. A flash of grief crossed his weathered face. Mrs. Eleanor had the vision. I just helped make it happen. And the house itself? I turned to Mrs. Winters. I know it's a lot to maintain. We manage well enough, she replied. I have Mrs. Lopez who comes in 3 days a week for the heavier cleaning, and Mr. Winters, my husband, handles maintenance and repairs. He's not here today, delivering a grandfather clock to be serviced in Riverside. I nodded, making mental notes. And the operating expenses? I understand there's an account. Yes, Mr. Harold set up a household account that covers salaries, utilities, maintenance, and such. Mr. Williamson can explain the details better than I can, but there's never been any issue with funds. Good, that's good. I sipped my tea, gathering courage for my next question. And Daniel? Mr. Williamson mentioned he keeps an office here? Another exchanged glance between the two staff members. In the library, Mrs. Winters confirmed. He comes 2 or 3 times a week, usually in the afternoons. He has his own key. I see. The thought of Daniel coming and going as he pleased made me uneasy. But I didn't want to make any hasty decisions. Thank you both for being so forthright. I'd like to walk through the house now if that's all right. I want to refamiliarize myself with everything. Of course. Mrs. Winters stood. Would you like me to accompany you? If you don't mind, I'd prefer to go alone. But perhaps afterward you could show me anything that needs attention. Repairs, updates, that sort of thing. Once they had left, I cradled my teacup, looking around the morning room with new eyes. The furniture was elegant but not ostentatious. The art on the walls selected with genuine appreciation rather than for status. Like everything at Pine Creek Manor, it reflected generations of thoughtful stewardship rather than showy wealth. Setting down my cup, I began my solitary tour of what was now my house. The ground floor flowed in a circular pattern, from the morning room to the formal living room with its grand piano that Eleanor had played beautifully, through to the dining room where countless family meals had taken place, into the large, country kitchen where Mrs. Winters presided, and then to the library where Daniel had established his office. I hesitated at the library door, feeling like I was encroaching on enemy territory. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open. The room was exactly as I remembered. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes, a massive oak desk positioned to catch the northern light, comfortable reading chairs grouped around a fireplace. What was new was the evidence of Daniel's presence, his laptop closed on the desk, a stack of Cooper development folders beside it, his monogrammed pen set arranged with mathematical precision. I didn't touch anything, merely observed. This space, like every other in Pine Creek Manor, now fell under my authority. The thought was still too enormous to fully comprehend. Moving on, I climbed the sweeping staircase to the second floor where the family bedrooms were located. Thomas's childhood room had been preserved largely as he'd left it when he went to college. Architectural drawings tacked to the walls, shelves filled with books on design and construction, swimming trophies from his high school days. I'd been in this room only once before, when Thomas had shyly shown me around during our first visit to his family home. I sat on the edge of his bed, running my hand over the simple blue quilt. I don't know what I'm doing here, I whispered, as if he might somehow hear me. I don't know how to be what they need me to be. Only silence answered me. But sitting in the space where Thomas had grown up, surrounded by the tangible evidence of his dreams and ambitions, I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced since the accident. Thomas had loved Pine Creek Manor not just for what it was, but for what it represented, a legacy of care, of responsibility to something greater than oneself. I continued my exploration, visiting each bedroom, Daniel's childhood room, now converted to a guest room. The master suite where Harold and Eleanor had shared their lives. Several other guest rooms, each with its own character. The third floor? Once servants' quarters, had been remodeled into a studio space where Eleanor had pursued her painting hobby, and a small apartment where the Winters lived. By the time I returned to the ground floor, I felt both overwhelmed and oddly at peace. Pine Creek Manor was undeniably beautiful, undeniably significant. But what struck me most was how fundamentally livable it was. Not a museum or a showpiece, but a home designed for family life and meaningful work. I found Mrs. Winters in the kitchen, preparing lunch. "There you are," she said. "I've made a simple salad and soup if you'd care to join me. Mr. Fenton's gone back to pruning the north garden." "That would be lovely, thank you." I settled, at the kitchen island, watching her efficient movements. "Mrs. Winters, how long have you worked for the Cooper family?" 37 years, she replied without hesitation. "I started as a young woman, just after Mr. Harold and Mrs. Eleanor married. They hired me away from the Prescott family, caused quite a stir in town at the time." A small smile played at her lips at the memory. "You must have seen a lot of changes." "Indeed I have." She placed a bowl of soup in front of me, homemade tomato basil, still a staple at Pine Creek Manor despite the passing seasons. "I was here when both boys were born. Watched them grow up, so different from each other even from the start." "Thomas spoke of you often," I said. "He said you made the best chocolate chip cookies in 3 counties. "Did he now?" Her expression softened with genuine pleasure. "That boy always did have a sweet tooth. Used to sneak down to the kitchen after bedtime, thinking I didn't know." She shook her head fondly. "Mr. Daniel was different, always followed the rules, but never quite understood the spirit behind them." It was a perceptive observation, capturing something essential about the two brothers. Thomas had been guided by an internal compass, while Daniel seemed to navigate by external markers of success. "What was Harold like when you first came to work here?" I asked, genuinely curious. I had only known him as an older man, already softened by age and illness. "Oh, Mr. Harold was quite something in those days. Dynamic, visionary. He built Cooper Development from a small local operation into what it is today, but never at the expense of his principles." She sat across from me with her own bowl of soup. "He believed business should serve the community, not just profit from it." "That's not exactly Daniel's philosophy," I observed. "No," she agreed simply. "It isn't." "Mrs. Winters," I ventured, "may I ask a personal question? What do you think of Harold and Eleanor's decision to leave Pine Creek Manor to me?" She considered her answer carefully. "I think," she said finally, "that they saw something in you that reminded them of the best parts of themselves. Mrs. Eleanor told me once, after Mr. Thomas passed, that you had steel underneath all that gentleness." High praise from her. The characterization brought unexpected tears to my eyes. "I don't feel very steel-like most days." "Yet here you are," Mrs. Winters pointed out, "facing a situation that would send many running for the hills." After lunch, Mrs. Winters showed me the practical aspects of the house that needed attention. A leak in the conservatory roof, the heating system that would need its annual service before winter, the ongoing project of updating the electrical, wiring in the east wing. She was thorough and professional, treating me as the rightful mistress of Pine Creek Manor without a hint of resentment or doubt. As I prepared to leave, I found myself reluctant to go. There was something healing about being in this space that had meant so much to Thomas, to Harold and Eleanor. Despite Daniel's presence in the library, the house itself felt welcoming, as if it recognized me as its new caretaker. "Mrs. Winters," I said at the door, "I'll be meeting with Mr. Barnes at Cooper Development tomorrow, and then the formal reading of the will is next Tuesday. After that, well, I'm not sure what happens next." "Life goes on, Mrs. Cooper," she said simply. "The house stands, the gardens grow, and we do our best by them. That's all any of us can do." Her practical wisdom steadied me. Thank you. I'll be in touch soon about next steps. As I drove back through the gates of Pine Creek Manor, I felt a strange certainty forming. Whatever Daniel might do to challenge the will, however uncertain I felt about my new role, I knew one thing clearly. I would not abandon what Harold and Eleanor had entrusted to me. Not out of greed or pride, but out of respect for their judgment and love for what Thomas had valued. The next morning, I dressed with particular care for my meeting with Richard Barnes at Cooper Development. The company headquarters occupied a renovated historic building in downtown Mapleton, a testament to Harold's commitment to preservation and community investment. The 4-story brick structure had once been a textile mill, its industrial bones now elegantly adapted to modern office use while maintaining its historic character. The receptionist, a young woman with a professional smile, looked up as I entered the marble-floored lobby. "Mrs. Cooper? Mr. Barnes is expecting you. I'll let him know you're here." I took a seat in the waiting area, studying the large photographs that adorned the walls. Images of Mapleton through the decades, many featuring Cooper development projects. There was the Riverside Park transformation, the historic theater renovation, the affordable housing complex on Oak Street. Each project reflected Harold's philosophy of development that enhanced rather than exploited the community. "Mrs. Cooper?" A deep voice drew my attention. Richard Barnes stood by the reception desk, tall, African-American, in his early 60s perhaps, with a distinguished salt and pepper, beard and kind eyes behind horn-rimmed glasses. "Thank you for coming. Please, follow me." He led me to an elevator at the back of the lobby. Harold's office, your office now, if you wish, is on the top floor. The elevator opened directly into a reception area where a woman approximately my age looked up with a warm smile. "Mrs. Cooper, welcome to Cooper Development. I'm Diane Matthews, Executive Assistant to the CEO. Can I get you coffee or tea before your meeting?" "Coffee would be wonderful, thank you," I replied, grateful for her easy manner. Richard Barnes led me through to a corner office with windows overlooking Mapleton's historic downtown. Unlike Daniel's sleek, impersonal workspace at Pine Creek Manor, this office clearly reflected Harold's character. Comfortable leather chairs, bookshelves filled with volumes on architecture and urban planning, framed family photographs among the business awards. "Please have a seat," Barnes gestured, to the sitting area rather than the imposing desk. "I imagine this is all somewhat overwhelming." "That's an understatement," I admitted, settling into one of the leather chairs. I knew almost nothing about Harold and Eleanor's plans until 2 days ago. "Harold wanted it that way," Barnes Tidis said, taking the chair opposite me as Diane brought in coffee. "He was concerned that if you knew in advance, Daniel might somehow pressure you before the arrangements were finalized. The thought of Daniel's likely reaction had been keeping me awake at night." "Mr. Barnes," "Richard, please." "Richard, I need to be completely honest with you. I know nothing about running a development company. I'm an art therapist. Before I married Thomas, I worked with children at the community center. I'm completely out of my depth here." His expression was understanding rather than alarmed. "Harold didn't expect you to step in as CEO, Rebecca, if I may call you that." I nodded, relieved. What he valued was your perspective, your heart. For the past few years, he'd been increasingly concerned about Daniel's influence on the company. Daniel saw Cooper Development primarily as a profit center, while Harold had always balanced profit with purpose. "The community focus," I said, remembering what Mrs. Winters had told me. "Exactly. Harold built this company on the principle that development should enhance the community, not extract from it. It's why Cooper projects are distinctive. They address real needs while respecting Mapleton's character and history." Richard leaned forward slightly. "Daniel has been pushing for a different approach, maximizing short-term returns, prioritizing luxury developments, even considering projects outside our traditional values. Like selling Pine Creek Manor to that resort developer, I said. Richard's expression confirmed my suspicion. Harold was devastated when he learned of Daniel's plans, not just because of the family history tied up in the property, but because the proposed development would have fundamentally altered that entire section of Mapleton. Increased traffic, environmental impacts, changing the character of a historic area. So Harold changed his will to prevent the sale, I concluded. It was more than that, Richard said carefully. Harold had been watching you since Thomas's accident. How you handled yourself. How you treated others even in your grief. He saw in you the values he believed in, the principles he'd tried to instill in his sons. I absorbed this, still struggling to reconcile the enormous responsibility with my own sense of inadequacy. What happens now? With the company, I mean. Richard took a sip of his coffee before answering. That's largely up to you. Legally, as majority shareholder, you have several options. You could sell your shares, though I hope you won't. You could remain a passive investor, leaving day-to-day operations to the management team. Or you could take a more active role in guiding the company's direction. And what would you recommend? He smiled slightly. Harold asked me the same question when he was considering his options. I'll tell you what I told him. This company works best when its leadership is aligned with its founding values. We need someone at the helm who understands that Cooper development isn't just about building structures, but about building community. Even if that someone knows nothing about real estate or business management, you can learn the business aspects, Richard said confidently. What can't be taught are the instincts, the values that guide decisions when the balance sheets don't provide clear answers. There was something steadying about his faith in me, not blind acceptance, but a considered belief that I could rise to this challenge. Still, I needed to understand exactly what I was facing. Daniel is on the board of directors, isn't he? Yes. As minority shareholder, he holds a seat. There are 5 board members total. You, Daniel, myself, Margaret Chen, who heads our legal department, and Dr. Wilson from the university's urban planning program. So not everyone will automatically oppose me, I concluded, thinking through the implications. Most of the board respected Harold's judgment. They'll give you a chance to prove yourself. Richard hesitated before continuing. But I should warn you, Daniel has been cultivating relationships with some of our major investors and partners. He may try to leverage those connections against you. Of course he will, I sighed. Richard, I need to ask, why are you telling me all this? You could have aligned yourself with Daniel long ago. It would certainly have been the safer career move. His expression turned reflective. I've been with this company for 28 years. Harold Cooper gave me my first real opportunity when most firms wouldn't consider someone with my background for a management position. He mentored me, challenged me, believed in me. But more than that, I believe in what Cooper Development stands for. Daniel's vision would fundamentally change that identity. He reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a file folder. This might help you understand what's at stake. Inside the folder were plans for several developments, a proposed luxury condominium complex that would require demolishing a historic neighborhood, a high-end shopping center that would compete directly with Mapleton's struggling downtown, a private golf community that would restrict access to previously public green space. These are Daniel's priority projects, Richard explained. He's been pushing the board to approve them for months. Harold was the main obstacle. I studied the renderings, my heart sinking. These projects represented everything Thomas had criticized about modern development, prioritizing affluence over community, erasing history for convenience, privatizing spaces that should belong to everyone. Harold trusted you to prevent this, Richard said quietly. He believed you would honor what Cooper Development has always stood for. The weight of that trust settled over me, Not just Harold and Eleanor's estate, but their values, their vision for what Mapleton could be. And by extension, Thomas's values too. "I need time," I said finally, "to learn, to understand what I'm dealing with. Will you help me?" Richard's face broke into a genuine smile. Nothing would honor Harold's memory more. We spent the next 2 hours reviewing the company's structure, its current projects, and the immediate decisions that would need my attention. Richard was thorough but patient, explaining complex financial and legal concepts in terms I could grasp, never making me feel foolish for my questions. By the time our meeting concluded, I had a clearer picture of both the challenges and opportunities before me. Cooper Development was financially sound, with a strong portfolio of properties and development projects. Its reputation in Mapleton was stellar, thanks to Harold's principled leadership. But Daniel's influence had been growing, and, with Harold gone, there was real risk of the company's direction changing dramatically. "The board meets next Thursday," Richard said as he walked me to the elevator. "That will be your first official introduction as majority shareholder. Daniel knows about the change in ownership now, but he likely expects you to be a figurehead he can manipulate or sideline." "Then he's in for a surprise," I said with more confidence than I felt. "Richard, thank you. For your candor, your support, and for believing in me when you have every reason to doubt." "Harold saw something in you," he said simply. "That's good enough for me, for now. The rest will be up to you to prove." As I drove back to my apartment, my mind whirled with new information and possibilities. The scale of what had been entrusted to me was becoming clearer, as were the forces aligned against me. Daniel wouldn't simply accept his parents' decision. He would fight with every resource at his disposal to regain control of what he considered his birthright. But something had shifted within me during these past 2 days, a quiet determination replacing the fog of grief that had enveloped me since Thomas's death. Harold, Eleanor, Richard Barnes, they all believed I was capable of this challenge. Perhaps it was time I began to believe it too. Back at the apartment, I found a delivery waiting, a large envelope from Williamson & Associates. Inside was a formal notice of the will reading scheduled for Tuesday, along with preliminary documentation of my inheritance. Also included was a smaller envelope with my name written in Harold's distinctive handwriting. With trembling fingers, I opened it. Unlike Eleanor's lengthy letter, Harold's note was brief and to the point. "Rebecca, by now you know what Eleanor and I have decided. I won't burden you with lengthy explanations. Eleanor has always been better with words than I am. I'll simply say this: a legacy is only as good as the hands it falls into. Yours are the right hands. Trust yourself as we have trusted you. With respect and affection. Harold." I traced his signature with my fingertip, tears blurring my vision. Harold Cooper had never been demonstrative or particularly warm, but in these few lines, I felt his faith in me, straightforward, unwavering. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "How did it go? Meeting for drinks at Harlow's tonight? You can tell me everything." I texted back my agreement, suddenly needing the normalcy of drinks with my best friend amidst the swirling changes of the past few days. Harlow's was a quiet bar in downtown Mapleton, far enough from the university to avoid the student crowds, but not so upscale that it attracted Daniel's circle. I arrived first, securing a booth in the back where we could talk privately. Jessica appeared moments later, her curly hair escaping from a hasty ponytail, her expression eager. "You look different," she said, sliding into the booth across from me. "More, I don't know. Present? Is that weird to say?" "It's been a strange few days," I admitted as the server brought our usual orders. Gin and tonic for me, craft. Beer for Jessica. "Tell me everything," she demanded, leaning forward. "Did you go to the house? What's happening with the company? Has Daniel had a complete meltdown yet?" I couldn't help smiling at her enthusiasm. Yes, and not publicly. At least. I recounted my visit to Pine Creek Manor, my meeting with Richard Barnes, and the growing clarity about what Harold and Eleanor had entrusted to me. "So you're basically the Queen of Mapleton now," Jessica concluded when I finished. "You own the big house on the hill and the company that built half the town." "It's not that simple," I protested. "Daniel still has significant ownership, and he knows the business in ways I don't. Plus, he has connections, relationships with investors and partners that I'm just learning about." "But you have the controlling interest," Jessica pointed out. "And from what you've told me about this Richard guy, you have allies too." "Maybe." I twirled the straw in my drink. "The thing is, Jess, I'm starting to feel responsible. Not just for the assets, but for what they represent. Harold built something that actually benefited this town. If Daniel takes control, that all changes." Jessica studied me over her beer. "You know what I think? I think Thomas would be incredibly proud of you right now." The mention of Thomas sent the usual pang through my heart, but it was accompanied by something new. A sense that I was honoring him by taking this responsibility seriously. "I hope so." "He would," Jessica said firmly. "Remember how passionate he was about thoughtful development? About preserving the character of communities while helping them grow? This is exactly the kind of thing that mattered to him." She was right. Thomas's architectural practice had been guided by those very principles. He had turned down lucrative projects when they conflicted with his values, something Daniel had criticized as naive idealism. "Speaking of Daniel," Jessica continued, her voice dropping slightly, "don't look now, but he just walked in with that lawyer friend of his. Brett, right?" I resisted the urge to turn around. "Is he looking this way?" "No, they're at the bar. But this is interesting. Melissa isn't with him, and he looks intense, like he's having a serious conversation. Probably plotting his next move," I said, taking a sip of my drink to steady my nerves. The thought of confronting Daniel in a public place made my stomach tighten. "We could leave," Jessica suggested, reading my discomfort. "Go back to my place. Open a bottle of wine." I considered it, tempted by the easy escape. But something held me back, that same quiet determination that had been growing within me. "No," I decided. "I'm not going to start running from him. This town isn't that big. We're bound to cross paths." "That's my girl," Jessica grinned. "So we stay, enjoy our drinks, and if he comes over, we handle it with grace and dignity. Or I could accidentally spill my beer on his fancy shoes. Your call." Her loyalty made me laugh, easing the tension. "Let's aim for grace and dignity. For now, anyway." We turned our conversation to other topics: Jessica's work at the university, library, a mutual friend's upcoming wedding, books we'd read recently, normal, grounding subjects that reminded me there was life beyond the Cooper family drama. I was just beginning to relax when a shadow fell across our table. Looking up, I found Daniel standing there, his expression carefully neutral, Brett hovering, awkwardly behind him. "Rebecca," Daniel said, his voice cool. "What a surprise." "Daniel," I kept my tone even. "Good evening, Brett. Mind if we join you?" Daniel didn't wait for an answer, sliding into the booth beside Jessica, who stiffened visibly. Brett hesitated before taking the seat next to me, his discomfort obvious. "Actually, we were just leaving," Jessica began, but I caught her eye and gave a slight shake of my head. "It's fine," I said. "We can be civil, can't we, Daniel?" "Of course." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "We're family, after all." The irony of his statement, after years of making me feel like an outsider, wasn't lost on anyone at the table. An uncomfortable silence fell, broken only when the server appeared to take Daniel and Brett's orders. Once she had gone, Daniel leaned forward slightly. "I spoke with Mr. Williamson today. The will reading is scheduled for Tuesday." "Yes, I received the notification," I replied. And you met with Richard Barnes at Cooper Development. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. I did. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Moving quickly, aren't you? Just trying to understand what Harold and Eleanor entrusted to me, I said, maintaining eye contact despite the urge to look away from his intensity. As anyone would in my position. Your position, Daniel repeated, his tone making the words an accusation. Let's be clear about that position, shall we? You were married to Thomas for 3 years. You've been a widow for 6 months. Somehow, in that brief time, you managed to convince my elderly, grieving parents to disinherit their only living son in favor of… What? Their dead son's wife? Jessica inhaled sharply beside him. That's completely out of line, Daniel. Is it? Daniel's gaze remained fixed on me. My parents built their lives around family legacy. The idea that they would suddenly decide to hand everything to someone who, let's be honest, was barely part of the family seems far-fetched. At best. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the sensation that had accompanied so many of Daniel's subtle put-downs over the years. But this time, I pushed past it, Eleanor's words about steel underneath echoing in my mind. I understand this is difficult for you, I said, keeping my voice steady. But Harold and Eleanor made their decision with clear minds and specific intentions. Mr. Williamson can confirm that. Williamson works for whoever pays him, Daniel dismissed. He's hardly an objective party. Brett cleared his throat. What Daniel means is that there are legitimate questions about the circumstances surrounding the change to the will. As his attorney, I've advised him that there are grounds for contesting it. On what basis? I asked, genuinely curious about their strategy. Undue influence, Brett replied promptly. Given the timing and the dramatic nature of the change, there's a case to be made that Harold and Eleanor were not acting entirely of their own volition. That's absurd, Jessica interjected. Becky spent time with them because she cared about them, not because she was plotting some elaborate inheritance scheme. Daniel's expression hardened. We'll let the courts decide what's absurd. In the meantime, Rebecca, I strongly suggest you consider a settlement. This could become very unpleasant, very public, and very expensive. The threat was clear. Daniel would drag my name through the mud, painting me as a manipulative gold digger who had taken advantage of vulnerable, grieving parents. The old Rebecca might have backed down, intimidated by the prospect of such a painful public battle. But that? Rebecca had been changed by grief, by loss, and now by the unexpected trust Harold and Eleanor had placed in me. I'm not afraid of unpleasantness, Daniel, I said quietly. I've survived worse. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, at my calm resistance. He had expected me to crumble, to seek the easiest path out of confrontation, as I often had in the past. This isn't just about you and me, he said, changing tack. It's about the Cooper legacy, generations of business relationships, community standing, family history. Do you really think you can step into that role? That people will accept you? I think, I replied carefully, that Harold and Eleanor believed I would honor their values and vision. That matters more to me than being accepted by the people you're worried about impressing. Daniel's mouth tightened into a thin line. You have no idea what you're getting into. Maybe not, I acknowledged, but I'm learning quickly. The server returned with their drinks, creating a momentary pause in the tense exchange. Brett used the opportunity to steer the conversation toward safer ground, asking Jessica about recent events at the university where she worked. She responded with cool politeness, her loyalty to me evident in every clipped word. Daniel remained, silent, studying me over the rim of his whiskey glass with calculated intensity. I met his gaze steadily, refusing to be the first to look away. In that moment, I understood something fundamental about Daniel Cooper. Beneath his confidence and Arrogance lay a profound insecurity. He had spent his life trying to prove himself worthy of the Cooper name. And now, to be passed over in favor of someone he considered an outsider was the ultimate rejection. That understanding didn't make me like him any better, but it helped me see him more clearly. This wasn't just about money or property. It was about validation, about worth. The morning of the will reading dawned with a crystalline autumn clarity that belied the tension ahead. I stood at my apartment window, watching golden leaves spiral down from the maple trees lining the street, wondering how a day so beautiful could contain such potential for ugliness. My phone had buzzed with texts since dawn, Jessica offering moral support, Mr. Williamson confirming the time, and a terse message from Daniel reminding me that family matters can always be settled privately. The implied threat was clear enough. I dressed with deliberate care, a simple navy dress that Eleanor had once admired, pearl earrings that had been a gift from Thomas on our first anniversary, low heels that wouldn't leave me towering over, Harold's attorney but would keep me eye to eye with Daniel. My reflection in the mirror looked composed, even confident, though my stomach churned with nerves. "You can do this," I told myself, echoing Jessica's words from the night before when she'd helped me prepare. "You've earned your place at that table." The drive to Williamson and Associates took barely 10 minutes, Mapleton being the kind of town where nothing was truly far from anything else. I arrived 15 minutes early, preferring to be settled before Daniel made his entrance. Mr. Williamson greeted me in the reception area, his kind eyes assessing my state of mind. "Mrs. Cooper," he said warmly, taking my outstretched hand. "Thank you for your punctuality. If you'd like a moment before the others arrive, my office is available to—" "Yo, thank you, but I'm fine waiting here," I replied, choosing a seat that would allow me to see the entrance. "Is Richard Barnes coming as well?" "Yes. As interim CEO of Cooper Development, he'll be present for the portions of the will related to the company. Mrs. Winters will also join us briefly, as there are specific provisions regarding the household staff at Pine Creek Manor." I nodded, somewhat relieved that I wouldn't be facing Daniel and his lawyer alone. The thought of Mrs. Winters brought a small measure of comfort. Her steady presence and clear-eyed perspective had already become a source of strength for me. The elegant wall clock in the reception area ticked steadily toward 10 o'clock. At precisely 9:55, the door opened to admit Richard Barnes, dressed impeccably in a charcoal suit, his manner professional yet supportive as he greeted me. Moments later, Mrs. Winters arrived, looking somewhat uncomfortable and formal, attire but carrying herself with dignity. At exactly 10 o'clock, the door opened once more. Daniel entered first, followed closely by Brett and a woman I didn't recognize. Elegantly dressed, with sharp features and an assessing gaze that took in the room in one sweeping glance. "Mr. Cooper," Williamson greeted Daniel with professional neutrality. "Mr. Harrington and Ms. Delacroix, I presume? I don't believe we've had the pleasure." "Camille Delacroix," the woman confirmed, her voice carrying a slight accent that suggested New Orleans heritage. "I'll be representing Mr. Cooper's interests today." Brett Harrington was a local attorney who had been Daniel's friend since college. Competent, enough for Mapleton's legal needs, but hardly a powerhouse. The introduction of this unknown lawyer suggested Daniel was escalating his strategy. "I see," Mr. Williamson replied, unruffled. While I wasn't informed that Mr. Cooper would be bringing additional counsel, Ms. Delacroix is certainly welcome to observe. "Shall we proceed to the conference room?" The large conference room had been arranged with careful attention to seating. Mr. Williamson at the head of the table, with chairs for Daniel and me on either side, our respective support, personnel fanning out from there. I took my place, smoothing my dress and meeting Daniel's cold stare with what I hoped was calm composure. "Before we begin," Daniel said before Williamson could speak, "I'd like to state for the record that I contest the validity of any amendments. to my parents' will made within the last 6 months of their lives. I believe they were subject to undue influence during a period of vulnerability and grief. Ms. Delacroix nodded approvingly beside him, while Brett shuffled papers as if searching for supporting documentation. Your objection is noted, Mr. Cooper, Williamson replied evenly. Now, if we may proceed with the reading itself, you'll have ample opportunity to file any formal challenges afterward. Daniel subsided, his jaw tight. I could feel the intensity of his resentment like a physical force across the polished mahogany table. I will now read the last will and testament of Harold James Cooper and Eleanor Bishop Cooper. As amended and notarized on March 15th of this year, Mr. Williamson began, his formal tone lending gravity to the proceedings. What followed was a detailed accounting of Harold and Eleanor's estate, not just Pine Creek Manor and the Cooper Development Holdings, but various investments, art collections, personal effects, and charitable bequests. The legal language washed over me in waves, significant phrases standing out from the formalities. To our daughter-in-law, Rebecca Mitchell Cooper, we bequeath Pine Creek Manor and all associated property comprising 12 acres. On controlling interest in Cooper Development Corporation, consisting of 60% of voting shares. Throughout the reading, I kept my expression neutral, though I couldn't help noticing the tightening of Daniel's features, as each major asset was officially assigned to me rather than to him. When Mr. Williamson detailed the 25% share of Cooper Development that Daniel would retain, a reduction from his previous 30%, his knuckles whitened, where they gripped the armrest of his chair. To the household staff of Pine Creek Manor, Mr. Williamson continued, nodding toward Mrs. Winters, specifically Margaret and Edward Winters and Jonathan Fenton, we leave the sum of $100,000 each in recognition of their faithful service, with the strong recommendation that they be retained in their current positions should Mrs. Rebecca Cooper wish to maintain residence at Pine Creek Manor. Mrs. Winters remained impassive, though a slight softening around her eyes suggested she was moved by the Coopers' generosity. Additionally, Williamson read, we have established a trust fund of $500,000 for any children born to or adopted by Thomas and Rebecca Cooper, to be held in trust until such children reach the age of 25. This provision caught me completely by surprise. Thomas and I had talked about having children someday, but his accident had happened before we'd begun trying to start a family. The thought that Harold and Eleanor had considered potential grandchildren I might still raise in Thomas's memory, brought unexpected tears to my eyes. I blinked them back quickly, unwilling to show emotion in front of Daniel. The reading continued with smaller bequests to distant relatives, longtime friends, and several charitable organizations. Finally, Mr. Williamson reached the end of the document. This concludes the reading of the will, he said, setting down the papers. Are there any immediate questions before we proceed to the next steps? Daniel leaned forward, his voice controlled but edged with tension. Yes. I'd like to know when exactly my parents made these changes, who was present, and what medical evaluations were conducted to ensure their competency. The amendments were executed on March 15th, as I stated at the outset, Williamson replied calmly. Present were myself, my associate Ms. Jacobs, Dr. Eleanor Patel, who conducted cognitive assessments of both your parents, and Reverend Miller from First Presbyterian as an additional witness. The medical reports are included in the documentation package, which your counsel is welcome to review. Convenient that I wasn't informed of these changes while my parents were still alive, Daniel observed acidly. Your parents specifically requested confidentiality until after their passing, Williamson countered, as was their right. Daniel's gaze shifted to me, his expression hardening. And I suppose you had no knowledge of these arrangements either. Rebecca, despite your suddenly close relationship with my parents in their final months? Before I could respond, Richard Barnes spoke up. Mr. Cooper, I was privileged to know your father for many years. He was not a man easily influenced or manipulated. His decisions, however unexpected they may seem to you, were his own. "With all due respect, Richard," Daniel replied, not sounding respectful at all, "you stand to benefit from this arrangement. As CEO under Rebecca's majority ownership, you'll have considerably more freedom than you would under my leadership." "That's enough, Daniel," I said quietly but firmly. "I understand this is difficult for you, but questioning everyone's integrity won't change the facts before us." "Facts?" Daniel gave a short, humorless laugh. "The fact is that you've somehow engineered the largest inheritance heist in Mapleton's history, and you expect everyone to simply accept it." "Mr. Cooper," Williamson interjected, his professional demeanor showing the first signs of strain. "Such accusations are both inappropriate and potentially actionable. I suggest you consult with your counsel before making further statements of that nature." Ms. Delacroix placed a restraining hand on Daniel's arm. "My client is understandably emotional given the circumstances. Perhaps we could take a brief recess?" Williamson nodded. 15 minutes. There's coffee and water in the reception area." As the others filed out, I remained seated, needing a moment to collect myself. Richard Barnes lingered by the door. "You're doing fine," he said quietly. Daniel's reaction was expected. He's trying to provoke you into saying something impulsive. "I know," I sighed. "It's just the trust fund for children. That caught me off guard." Richard's expression softened. "Harold mentioned it to me once. He said regardless of what happened between you and the family, any child of Thomas's deserved their birthright." The simple statement threatened to unravel my composure. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Thank you, Richard. I'll join you all in a moment." Left alone in the conference room, I allowed myself a brief moment of vulnerability. The prickle of tears, a tightness in my throat, the familiar ache of missing Thomas that never quite subsided. Then, carefully, I rebuilt my composure piece by piece, reminding myself of Harold's plain-spoken faith in me, of Eleanor's letter, of the responsibility I had accepted. When I emerged into the reception area, the tension was palpable. Daniel and his attorneys stood in one corner, speaking in hushed tones. Mrs. Winters sat alone, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. Richard was engaged in quiet conversation, with Mr. Williamson near the coffee service. I approached Mrs. Winters first. "Are you all right?" I asked softly. Her steady gaze met mine. "Quite all right, Mrs. Cooper. Though I admit, it's strange to hear one's life's work reduced to legal terminology. I want you to know," I said impulsively, "that your position at Pine Creek Manor is secure as long as you wish to stay, regardless of what happens with everything else." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I appreciate that, Mrs. Cooper. The manor has been my home for nearly 4 decades. I wouldn't know where else to belong." Her simple statement crystallized something for me. Pine Creek Manor wasn't just property to be fought over. It was a home, a living history, a place where people had built their lives. Whatever Daniel might do legally, I couldn't allow that essence to be lost. When we reconvened in the conference room, the atmosphere had shifted subtly. Daniel seemed more contained, Ms. Delacroix more prominent in the conversation. I sensed a strategic adjustment had been made. "Mr. Williamson," Ms. Delacroix began once everyone was seated, "my client wishes to propose an alternative resolution that might satisfy all parties without protracted legal proceedings." Williamson raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening, though. I should note that Mrs. Cooper is under no obligation to consider alternatives to the clearly expressed wishes in the will." "Of course," she acknowledged smoothly. "However, given the potential for lengthy litigation and the harm such public discord might cause to the Cooper family name and business interests, we believe a negotiated settlement would benefit everyone." I glanced at Richard, whose slight frown suggested skepticism. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked. Daniel leaned forward, seeming more controlled than before. A clean division. You retain ownership of the apartment and a generous financial settlement. Let's say $5 million. Pine Creek Manor and Cooper Development return to family control, where they belong. The offer was substantial, far more money than I had ever imagined possessing, but the implication that I wasn't family stung nonetheless. "Daniel, I," said, meeting his gaze directly, "do you understand why your parents made these choices? Have you read the letters they left?" A flicker of something, pain, perhaps, crossed his face before his expression hardened again. My parents were not themselves in their final months. Their grief over Thomas clouded their judgment, and you took advantage of that vulnerability. "That's not true," I replied quietly. "They were concerned about your plans for Pine Creek Manor, for Cooper Development. They saw you moving away from the values they'd built their lives around." "Values?" Daniel scoffed. "Business evolves." "Rebecca, my father's sentimental approach to development might have worked 30 years ago, but today's market demands innovation, efficiency, profitability." "At what cost?" I challenged. "Tearing down historic neighborhoods for luxury condos? Turning Pine Creek Manor into a resort that would change the character of the entire area?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "You know nothing about business. Nothing about what it takes to keep a company competitive in today's environment." "Perhaps not," I conceded. "But I do know what Harold and Eleanor valued, what Thomas believed in, and it wasn't maximizing profit at the expense of community." Ms. Delacroix cleared her throat delicately. "This philosophical debate, while fascinating, doesn't address the practical reality. Mrs. Cooper, my client is prepared to contest this will aggressively. The litigation could take years, during which time Cooper Development will be in limbo, its reputation potentially damaged. Pine Creek Manor will remain in legal uncertainty, unable to be sold or significantly altered. In other words," Bretty added, speaking for the first time, "nobody wins if this goes to court." I considered their words carefully. They were right about one thing. A protracted legal battle would benefit no one, least of all the community that depended on Cooper. Development stability. "I'm not interested in selling Pine Creek Manor," I said finally, "or in relinquishing control of Cooper Development. But I am willing to discuss how we might work together, Daniel, in ways that honor your parents' legacy while allowing for necessary evolution." Daniel's expression darkened. "That's not acceptable." "Then we appear to be at an impasse," I replied, surprising myself with my calmness. "I won't be pressured or threatened into surrendering what Harold and Eleanor entrusted to me, no matter how generous the financial incentive might seem." Ms. Delacroix studied me with new interest, as if recalculating her assessment. "Mrs. Cooper, perhaps we should schedule a more private discussion." "No," Daniel interrupted sharply. "There's nothing to discuss. Either she accepts our reasonable offer, or we proceed with contesting the will. There is no middle ground here." Mr. Williamson interjected smoothly. "I suggest all parties take some time to reflect on their positions. These matters are rarely well served by immediate decisions made in moments of high emotion." "I agree," Richard said, his steady voice a counterpoint to Daniel's intensity. "The board meeting is scheduled for Thursday. Perhaps we should proceed with that as planned, allowing Mrs. Cooper to better understand the company she now controls, before making any binding decisions." Daniel looked as if he might object, but Ms. Delacroix placed a restraining hand on his arm. "A sensible suggestion. My client reserves all rights to contest the will, but we can certainly allow a few days for consideration." With that, the formal proceedings concluded. As we gathered our belongings, the division in the room was palpable. Daniel and his attorneys on one side, Richard, Mrs. Winters, and me on the other, with Mr. Williamson maintaining his professional neutrality in the middle. As I prepared to leave, Daniel approached me. stepping close enough that only I could hear his words. "You think you've won, don't you? That you can step into my family and take what should have been mine?" I met his gaze steadily. "This isn't about winning, Daniel. It never was." "Maybe not for you," he replied, his voice low and taut with suppressed anger. "But make no mistake, I will not allow my parents' legacy to be controlled by someone who married into the Cooper name for 3 brief years. Whatever it takes, whatever it costs, I will reclaim what belongs to me." Before I could respond, he turned and strode from the room, his attorneys hurrying to follow. The intensity of his hatred left me momentarily shaken, but also strangely resolved. Daniel's vision for the Cooper legacy was so fundamentally at odds with what Harold, Eleanor, and Thomas had valued that I couldn't simply walk away, no matter how difficult the path ahead might be. Richard approached as the door closed behind Daniel's group. "That went about as expected," he observed dryly. "He really hates me," I said, still processing Daniel's parting words. "It's not personal," Richard replied. "Or rather, it's not just personal. Daniel has been positioning himself to take full control of Cooper development for years. Your inheritance disrupts plans he's been crafting since well before Thomas's accident." "What kind of plans?" I asked, suddenly concerned about what might be happening at the company beneath the surface. Richard glanced at his watch. "Too complex to get into now, but I have a comprehensive briefing prepared for you before Thursday's board meeting. Could you come to my office tomorrow morning, say 9 o'clock? I agreed, thanking him again for his support before turning to Mrs. Winters, who had been waiting patiently nearby. "Mrs. Winters, may I offer you a ride back to Pine Creek Manor?" She accepted with a gracious nod. As we walked to my car, her presence beside me was steadying, a reminder of the real lives connected to these legal abstractions we'd been discussing. Once we were driving through Mapleton's tree-lined streets, Mrs. Winters broke her customary reserve. "Mr. Daniel has always struggled with disappointment," she observed. "Even as a boy, he couldn't bear to lose at games or sports. Mr. Thomas used to let him win sometimes, just to keep the peace." The small insight into their childhood dynamic felt precious, another piece of Thomas that I could hold on to. "Daniel said something during the reading about my suddenly close relationship with Harold and Eleanor, but it wasn't sudden, was it? It evolved naturally after Thomas died." Mrs. Winters nodded. "Grief has a way of either separating people or drawing them together. With you and the elder Coopers, it was the latter. You brought them comfort in their sorrow, reminded them of their son in ways that Mr. Daniel never could. Because Daniel and Thomas were so different," I murmured, thinking of the brothers' contrasting approaches to life. "As different as night and day," Mrs. Winters confirmed. "Mr. Thomas had his father's vision and his mother's heart. Mr. Daniel has his father's determination, but not his principles." We drove in contemplative silence for a while, the familiar landmarks of Mapleton passing by, the historic courthouse with its white columns, the riverside park that Cooper Development had restored a decade ago, the community center where I had once worked as an art therapist before marrying Thomas. "Mrs. Winters," I said as we turned onto the winding road that led to Pine Creek Manor, "what would you do if you were in my position?" She considered the question carefully before answering. "I'm a simple woman, Mrs. Cooper, not accustomed to such weighty decisions. But I believe when someone entrusts you with something precious, the only honorable response is to protect it as they would have wished." Her straightforward wisdom resonated with what I had been feeling since first learning of my inheritance. This wasn't about what I wanted or what would be easiest. It was about honoring a trust placed in me. As we approached Pine Creek Manor, the house came into view, stately without being ostentatious, its weathered brick and white columns speaking of permanence and care rather than showy wealth. I felt again that strange sense of belonging that had surprised me during my previous visit. "Would you like to come in for tea?" Mrs. Winters offered as I parked in the circular drive. "You look as though you could use a moment of calm before facing the rest of your day." I accepted gratefully, following her into the house that now legally belonged to me, but still felt more like a responsibility than a possession. In the familiar kitchen, with its well-worn countertops and cheerful yellow curtains that Eleanor had sewn herself, Mrs. Winters moved with efficient grace, putting the kettle on and setting out Eleanor's favorite blue teacups. "Mr. Daniel came by yesterday," she mentioned as we waited for the water to boil. "He was in his father's library for several hours, taking papers from the look of it." I frowned. "Did he say what he was doing?" "It's not my place to question the family," she replied, though her tone suggested disapproval, but he left with a briefcase fuller than when he arrived. The information troubled me. What documents might Daniel have taken, and why? Was he searching for ammunition to use against me, or removing evidence that might support Harold and Eleanor's decision? "Mrs. Winters, would you mind showing me the library after tea? I should familiarize myself with everything, especially if Daniel has been removing items." She nodded approvingly. "A wise precaution, Mrs. Cooper." The tea ritual provided a welcome interlude of normalcy amidst the day's tensions. Mrs. Winters served Earl Grey, Harold's preferred blend, with small lemon cookies that she mentioned making fresh that morning. We spoke of practical matters, the upcoming winterization of the gardens, the annual servicing of the heating system, the leak in the conservatory roof that Mr. Winters planned to repair the following week. Such ordinary concerns were oddly comforting after the high drama of the will reading. This was the real legacy I had inherited, not just legal ownership of a property, but responsibility for a living, working household with its own rhythms and needs. After tea, Mrs. Winters led me to Harold's library. The moment I stepped into the room, I could sense something was different from my previous visit. The space felt disturbed somehow, its careful order disrupted in subtle ways. Mr. Daniel was particularly interested in those filing cabinets, Mrs. Winters observed, indicating a row of oak cabinets along one wall, and in Mr. Harold's desk. I moved to the desk first, noting that it had been cleared of the papers I'd seen during my last visit. The drawers, when I opened them, contained only basic supplies: pens, notepads, paper clips. No files, no documents, nothing of substance. The desk usually contained Mr. Harold's current projects, Mrs. Winters confirmed when I mentioned this. He was very organized about his papers. The filing cabinets proved similarly depleted. While not entirely empty, they contained mainly older documents, tax returns from 5 years ago, outdated insurance policies, household records. Nothing related to Cooper development. Nothing about recent business decisions or Harold's concerns, about Daniel's direction for the company. He's taken everything relevant, I realized aloud. Anything that might show what Harold was thinking in his final months. Mrs. Winters' expression remained neutral, but her eyes reflected understanding. Mr. Harold kept digital records as well, she mentioned, on his computer there. She nodded toward a desktop computer on a side table, its screen dark. I approached, it hesitantly, feeling like an intruder despite my legal right to be there. "Do you know the password?" "Eleanor 1943, Mrs. Winters replied without hesitation. Mr. Harold wasn't one for complicated security measures, I'm afraid. The computer came to life when I pressed the power button, requesting the password that Mrs. Winters had provided. Once logged in, I found myself looking at Harold's desktop. Neatly organized folders labeled with project names and dates. But when I began clicking through them, I discovered that many were empty or contained only non-essential files. The most recent folders, those dated within the last 6 months, appeared to have been systematically purged. "Daniel's been thorough," I murmured, increasingly concerned about what he might have taken and why it had seemed so important to remove. Mrs. Winters watched from near the door, her expression troubled. "Mrs. Cooper, there is one thing Mr. Daniel wouldn't know about. Mr. Harold had a private safe behind that painting there. She indicated a landscape of Pine Creek Manor that hung on the wall opposite the desk. I moved to the painting, carefully, lifting it away from the wall to reveal a small wall safe with a digital keypad. "Do you know the combination?" "Thomas's birthday," Mrs. Winters said softly. "Mr. Harold changed it after the accident." The significance of that choice wasn't lost on me. I entered the date, 09/15/85, and heard the soft click of the lock disengaging. Inside the safe was a single USB drive and a leather-bound journal. "He wrote in that every evening," Mrs. Winters told me. "A habit from his younger days that he returned to after Mr. Thomas passed, said it helped him organize his thoughts." I held the journal carefully, feeling as though I was touching something deeply personal. "Thank you for showing me this, Mrs. Winters. I don't think I would have found it otherwise." Mr. Harold valued transparency in business, but believed in privacy for personal matters, she replied. "He would want you to have those items, especially now." With the journal and USB drive secured in my purse, I thanked Mrs. Winters and prepared to leave. As we walked through the entrance hall, she paused by a small side table that held family photographs. "Mrs. Cooper," she said, lifting a silver-framed photo of Thomas as a young man. "Mr. Harold and Mrs. Eleanor made their choice with clear minds and open hearts. Whatever Mr. Daniel might claim, they knew exactly what they were doing when they entrusted Pine Creek Manor and the company to you." Her quiet certainty steadied me. "I won't let them down," I promised. "Or Thomas." "I know you won't," she replied simply. "You have more strength than perhaps even you realize." Driving back to my apartment, I felt the weight of the journal and USB drive in my purse like a physical presence. Whatever Harold had recorded in those private reflections might provide insight not just into his decision to change his will, but into the concerns about Daniel that had prompted such a dramatic action. I needed time and privacy to explore these materials properly. But first, I had a promise to keep, meeting Jessica for a late lunch to report on the will reading. Despite the gravity of what I'd discovered at Pine Creek Manor, I found myself looking forward to the normalcy of lunch with my best friend, to being simply Becky for an hour rather than Mrs. Cooper, with all its newly complicated implications. As I parked outside Rosie's Cafe, I caught sight of my reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back at me seemed different somehow, more determined perhaps, or simply more purposeful than the grief-shadowed person I'd been for the past 6 months. Harold and Eleanor had seen something in me worth trusting with their legacy. Now I needed to prove them right, not just for their sake or for Thomas's memory, but for my own sense of purpose moving forward. The journal in my purse held secrets that might help me understand exactly what I was fighting for. And fight I would, I realized with sudden clarity. Not out of greed or pride, but because some legacies deserve to be protected, even from those who claimed them by birthright alone. The evening after the will reading, I sat alone in my apartment with Harold's journal open on my lap and the USB drive connected to my laptop. Outside, rain pattered gently against the windows, matching my contemplative mood. I had spent the afternoon with Jessica, recounting the tense confrontation at Williamson's office, while she alternated between outrage and strategic advice. Now, I turned my attention to Harold's journal. The leather-bound book was filled with his distinctive architectural lettering beginning shortly after Thomas's death. As I read, a clearer picture emerged of the growing rift between Harold and his surviving son. Daniel had been pushing for changes at Cooper Development that contradicted the company's values, proposing projects that would displace long-time residents, lobbying for zoning variances that would allow oversized developments in historic neighborhoods, forming alliances with outside investors who cared only for profit. February 24th. Rebecca came by today to help Eleanor with the photo albums. It was the first time I've seen my wife truly engaged since Thomas's passing. What struck me was how she asked about the town in the old photographs, the buildings Cooper Development had restored, the parks we'd helped create. She understands instinctively that our work has always been about more than just construction or profit. The final entries detailed the careful legal preparations, medical evaluations, and thoughtful consideration that had gone into their decision to change their will. Far from the impulsive, grief-driven choice that Daniel had characterized, it had been a deliberate process undertaken with clear minds. March 20th. All arrangements are complete. I feel a sense of peace knowing that Pine Creek Manor and Cooper Development will continue under stewardship that honors their true purpose. Daniel will be angry, perhaps unforgiving. Rebecca may face significant challenges, but Eleanor and I believe she possesses the strength to withstand them. Some legacies are not defined by blood but by shared vision and values. I closed the journal, tears blurring my vision. Harold's words offered validation I hadn't realized I needed. Confirmation that their decision had been thoughtful rather than impulsive, based on genuine faith in me rather than simply rejection of Daniel. Turning to the USB drive, I found numerous folders meticulously organized. What caught my attention was a folder labeled Daniel Concerns. Inside were dozens of documented instances where Daniel had pushed ethical boundaries in pursuit of profit, including evidence of his negotiations with Evergreen Resorts regarding Pine Creek Manor. He had been planning to sell the property for over a year, even commissioning preliminary designs for converting the historic property into a luxury resort while his parents were still living there. One email from Daniel was particularly revealing. Let's keep the timeline flexible for now. My parents are resistant to the idea of moving, but at their age, circumstances can change quickly. I anticipate having full authority over the property within the year, at which point we can proceed without unnecessary sentimentality about the historic value of what is essentially just an old house on valuable land. The coldness of his calculation chilled me. Even more troubling were documents suggesting Daniel had been systematically redirecting Cooper Development resources toward personal projects, using company contractors for renovations on his private residence, charging personal travel to business accounts, even creating a shell company positioned to purchase Cooper Development properties at below-market rates. I reached for my phone, dialing Richard Barnes. Despite the late hour, he answered on the second ring. We arranged to meet early the next morning before the board meeting to review the materials and develop a strategy. The board meeting proved more confrontational than I had anticipated. Daniel arrived with Brett Harrington and a banker named James Everett, who had concerns about the company's stability given the change in leadership. It was clearly a coordinated strategy to use financial pressure to force me into ceding practical control to Daniel. Enhanced reporting requirements, co-approval authority for significant expenditures, possibly additional collateral requirements, Everett explained when asked what measures the bank was considering. Standard protections when a lending institution has concerns about management stability. I took a measured breath before responding. Mr. Everett, I appreciate your candor. However, Cooper Development's financial position is stronger than it has been in 5 years, with project returns exceeding projections by an average of 12%. The management team that delivered these results remains intact, with Richard Barnes continuing as CEO with my full confidence. I slid a document across the table. This is a letter from Jameson National Bank expressing interest in establishing a primary banking relationship with Cooper Development. They're particularly interested in our community-focused development model. I had hoped to maintain our historic relationship with Mapleton first, but if that's no longer possible under mutually respectful terms, we have alternatives. The banker's expression shifted from confidence to concern as he scanned the letter. I continued. Additionally, I should mention that Harold left me extensive documentation regarding certain irregularities in project financing over the past 2 years. I handed several folders to Margaret Chen, the company's legal counsel, whose eyebrows rose slightly as she examined the contents. Daniel's face had drained of color. "What exactly are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything, Daniel," I replied calmly. "I'm simply ensuring that all board members have complete information before making decisions about the company's future direction." After Everett departed, Daniel presented plans for a luxury condominium development that would require demolishing a historic neighborhood. "The market potential is exceptional," he argued, displaying renderings of glass and steel towers that seemed jarringly out of place with Mapleton's character. "Initial projections indicate a 30% return on investment, at the cost of displacing longtime residents and erasing architectural history," I observed. "Have we conducted community impact studies, explored alternatives that might preserve the historic character while allowing for thoughtful redevelopment?" I distributed copies of an alternative concept, a thoughtful renovation that would maintain the neighborhood's character while addressing infrastructure needs and creating new economic opportunities. Daniel's control finally snapped. "This is absurd. You've been involved with this company for less than a week, and you presume to redirect established strategic initiatives based on outdated sentimentality?" "Not sentimentality, Daniel," I corrected gently. "Values. The same values that built Cooper Development's reputation and success." "Don't lecture me about my parents' values," he exploded. "I worked alongside my father for 20 years while you were nowhere in the picture. You manipulated them when they were vulnerable, and now you think you can waltz in and take control of everything my family built?" "I understand this is difficult for you," I said quietly. "But I didn't manipulate anyone. Harold and Eleanor made their choice based on their assessment of who would best honor their vision for Cooper Development and Pine Creek Manor." Margaret looked up from the documents I'd provided, her expression grave. "Mrs. Cooper, these materials warrant further investigation. There appear to be several instances of potential conflicts of interest and questionable allocation of corporate resources." Daniel stormed from the room, leaving an uncomfortable silence. The remainder of the meeting proceeded professionally, with board members seemingly reassured by my handling of the confrontation. We authorized an internal audit, approved the alternative approach to the neighborhood project, and established communication protocols during this transitional period. As the meeting concluded, Dr. Wilson from the university approached me. "Mrs. Cooper, I confess I had reservations about Harold's decision to entrust the company to someone with your limited business background. Consider those reservations addressed. You demonstrated exactly the balance of principle and pragmatism that Cooper Development requires." Later, as Richard and I discussed next steps in his office, he mentioned an idea Harold had once considered: establishing an arts and culture foundation that would use Pine Creek Manor as its center. Thomas was quite enthusiastic about the concept, apparently. He even drafted some preliminary designs for adapting spaces while preserving the historic character. The possibility resonated deeply, a way to preserve Pine Creek Manor while giving it renewed purpose and meaning. I could maintain the private family quarters while opening other areas for community benefit, creating something that honored the past while building toward the future. That afternoon, I drove to Pine Creek Manor and was greeted by Mrs. Winters, who seemed unsurprised by my unannounced arrival. As she served tea in Eleanor's favorite blue cups, I shared the events of the board meeting and Richard's suggestion about repurposing parts of the manor. "An arts foundation," Mrs. Winters mused. "Mrs. Eleanor would have approved, I think. She always said this house was too full of history to keep to ourselves." We discussed logistics, which spaces might work best for public programs, how the gardens could be maintained for educational purposes, what staffing might be needed. As the afternoon light began to fade, I found myself reluctant to leave. "Mrs. Winters," I said impulsively, "would it be possible for me to stay here tonight? I'm not ready to move in permanently yet, but perhaps spending some time here would help me decide about the foundation idea." "Your room is always ready, Mrs. Cooper," she replied with quiet dignity. "This is your home now, whenever you choose to claim it." That night, I slept in the guest room that had been designated as mine during visits with Thomas. Before sleeping, I walked through the quiet house, imagining how it might evolve into something that honored its past while embracing a new purpose. In Thomas's old room, I sat on the edge of the bed, running my fingers over architectural drawings he had tacked to the walls as a teenager. In this space, surrounded by the tangible remains of his dreams, I felt closer to him than I had in months. "I'm trying to do right by your family," I whispered into the quiet room. "By what you believed in." There was no answer, of course, but as I returned to my own room and settled into sleep, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me since the accident. Whatever challenges lay ahead with Daniel, I now had clarity about my purpose. The worthless daughter-in-law Daniel had dismissed at that family dinner had found her worth, not in his acceptance or in the material assets she had inherited, but in her commitment to values that transcended both. Harold and Eleanor had recognized what Daniel couldn't see: that legacy isn't measured in buildings or bank accounts, but in the principles that guide how those resources are used. 6 months later, I stood on the manor's front steps during the grand opening of the Cooper Cultural Foundation, watching children explore the gardens and community members fill the galleries we'd created. Daniel had eventually settled the legal challenges in exchange for a role in Cooper Development's international division, far from Mapleton and the daily operations he'd tried to control. The path hadn't been easy. Transforming Pine Creek Manor, while preserving its character, had required countless decisions, compromises, and leaps of faith. Cooper Development had weathered the transition, emerging with renewed commitment to Harold's vision of development that enhanced community rather than exploiting it. As the sun slanted through the autumn leaves, casting the same golden glow I'd noticed on my first visit as the manor's owner, I felt Thomas's presence beside me. Not in any supernatural way, but in the continuation of his values, his vision, his love for this place and what it could mean to Mapleton. "Worthless?" I whispered to myself with a smile. "Not anymore." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass. These up. Just click and check them out.